If you were alive in California in the mid-1800s, the world would have looked nothing like the postcard sunsets and coastal highways we know today. Back then, the edges of the continent were not marked by roads or fences or city lights. They were marked by shadows. Shadows cast by living structures so massive that even the first settlers struggled to describe them without sounding unhinged or poetic. Travelers wrote of trees with trunks so vast they seemed like fragments of walls from a forgotten city. Stumps that stretched wider than cabins, crowns that vanished into a permanent veil of mist. You didn't walk beside these forests. You walked under them, swallowed whole by a cathedral of living wood. The early diaries of trappers and prospectors often open with the same disbelief. These are not trees, these are giants. California, before the gold rush frenzy, was a world of titans, a world where the ground was soft with centuries of fallen needles, and the air carried the thick scent of sap, a scent so heavy it clung to clothes, skin, and memory. Forests weren't simply part of the landscape, they were the landscape. Dense, endless, primeval. From the red-blazed mountains of Humboldt to the dark valleys of Santa Cruz, these groves stood as if grown during a different age, an older, stranger earth. Settlers looked up and saw pillars holding the sky. Native tribes told stories of sky trees, living beings that kept the world in balance, creatures of wind and season, whose roots dug deep into the spine of the earth itself. To them, the forest wasn't wood. It was history. It was memory. It was alive in ways forgotten by modern time. And yet, despite their size, despite their age, despite the reverence written about them, within a single generation, a blink in the life of any tree, almost all of them were gone. This is the part of California's past that rarely makes it into textbooks. We hear of miners and mountains of gold, of fortune seekers and lawless towns. But few mention the other rush that began quietly in the shadows of these giants, the rush for timber, the slow and methodical dismantling of forests so ancient that they made the new cities look temporary in comparison. But something about the scale of these trees, something about their uncanny size in old journals and the eerie proportions in early photographs, raises a question that has lingered for more than a century. What exactly was cut down? And why did it vanish so completely? Because if the early accounts were exaggerated, you would expect contradictions. If the trees were merely big, you would expect modern comparisons. But the more you read, the more the numbers repeat, the more the descriptions align, the more the silence of official history stands out as its own kind of evidence. You want to understand how the giants fell, you first have to understand the men who swung the axes. By the 1850s, California's forests had become a magnet for the desperate, the wanderers, the dreamers who lost their fortunes in the gold fields. These were not polished men, not engineers, not city builders. They were muscle wrapped in flannel and sweat. Men whose hands were so calloused they could grip the teeth of a saw without bleeding. They lived far from towns, deep in the wilderness where the canopies swallowed the sky, and daylight passed through the redwood trunks like thin spears. Logging camps were not warm, bustling communities. They were rough outposts of bark, canvas, mud, and firelight. Islands of human noise in an ocean of ancient silence, their shelters were thrown together with whatever they could find. Stripped bark for walls, moss for insulation, branches tied with rope. The floors were damp earth. the roofs leaked. At night, the forest groaned, creaked, whispered. And the men, exhausted from 12 or 14 hours of swinging steel, fell asleep, listening to the sounds of beings far larger than themselves. The work was brutal in a way few modern people can imagine. No chainsaws, no engines, no machinery that could match the scale of the giants they faced. Just axes weighing as much as a newborn child, and crosscut saws long enough to take 4 men to control. Each sawtooth bite sent vibrations through the wood and up their arms like the pulse of something alive. And in those days, the trees didn't fall in a single afternoon. Felling one of the largest giants could take days, sometimes weeks. The men first built springboards, wooden platforms hammered into the trunk 10 or 15 feet above the ground. Why? Because the base of the tree was too wide to cut through, too dense, too ancient. They had to climb upward just to find a point where the trunk narrowed enough to begin sawing 2 men on each side of the saw, rocking back and forth, hour after hour, until the rhythm felt like a heartbeat. Journals from that era, the ones that survive, describe a strange duality. On one hand, exhaustion, injury, hunger, and danger. On the other, awe so deep it bordered on fear. Some lumberjacks wrote that they felt dwarfed by the forest in a way that threatened their sense of scale, of reality, that standing beside a giant redwood made them feel like they were insects among pillars of another civilization. A few even wrote that the trees seemed to watch, that working near them brought dreams, headaches, or an eerie sense of being trespassers in a place too old for human time. These men were not poets, not spiritualists. But you can feel the truth in their words. The forest was more than wood. It was a world unto itself, ancient and patient, and to cut it was to challenge something far older than the human species. And yet, the lumberjacks kept cutting, not because they wanted to destroy something sacred, but because they needed to survive. The forest seemed endless, eternal. How could a few men with saws possibly make a difference? But the difference was enormous. As logging camps multiplied, as crews spread into valleys and along rivers, as sawmills sprouted like metal parasites along the coast, the rhythm of the forest began to shift. The giants no longer creaked in the wind. They creaked under the strain of steel. Each fall shook the earth for miles. Each stump was a monument to a life that had stood for centuries. And still, something felt off. Many lumberjacks wrote about the strange choices made by the logging companies. Why target the oldest trees first? Why focus on valleys far from easy transport routes? Why begin clearings in areas where no settlements yet existed? These questions linger in their diaries like quiet warnings. Echoes of confusion from men who sensed they were part of something larger, something hidden, something they didn't understand. If you stand before a modern redwood today, even the tallest and widest among them, you'll feel small, humbled, silenced. Redwoods are among the greatest living organisms on the planet, but if the early accounts from the mid-1800s are to be believed, they were merely descendants, not the originals. Shadows of something far older, echoes of giants that no longer exist. The surviving photographs from that era, the few that escaped fires, floods, and missing archives, show something unsettling. Men stand beside stumps so wide that 10 of them could stretch their arms and still not span the diameter. Wagons look like toys. Horses look miniaturized. The scale of these stumps feels almost comical, almost surreal. as if a modern viewer is looking at a manipulated image. But these are real photos from real logging sites. And that's the first clue that something doesn't add up. Modern redwoods can grow massive, yes, some exceeding 20 feet in diameter and 350 feet in height. But the trees described in 1850s journals weren't simply large. They were unnatural by today's standards, or at least incompatible with our current environment. Logging records mention diameters of 30, 40, even 50 feet, heights so immense that lumberjacks measured the fall of a tree not by distance, but by time. There are diary entries describing the sound of a tree crashing to the ground nearly a full minute after the final cut, a delay so strange it borders on legend. But multiple sources repeat this same strange detail: a fall that was felt before it was heard, a tremor in the ground before the echo reached the ears. To the loggers, these weren't trees. They were walls, towers, monoliths of another age. Surveyors from the 1840s left behind descriptions that sound closer to ancient mythology than forestry reports. One wrote that the crowns of certain trees disappeared into a world above ours. Another called them remnants of another age of Earth. A few even used the word unnatural, not as criticism, but as awe, as if the trees belonged to a time when the natural laws we know today did not yet exist. These accounts weren't written by poets, philosophers, or mystics. They were written by practical men, foresters, trappers, lumberjacks, and early settlers, men who had no linguistic toolkit for describing something so far outside the scale of ordinary experience. But if their descriptions were exaggerated, if their memories were flawed, if their eyes played tricks on them, why do the numbers repeat so consistently across so many independent sources? Why do the earliest photographs support their claims? And why do modern redwoods, magnificent as they are, never come close to the scale documented in the 1850s? This leads to a larger question. Not a claim, not a conclusion, but a mystery. Were these giants simply lost due to time, or were they survivors of a different Earth entirely? An Earth with heavier air, richer oxygen, deeper soil, and different environmental pressures. Some paleobotanists suggest that Earth once supported megaflora. Far beyond anything living today, fossils of colossal ancient plants exist. But California's giants appear to have been alive far later than they should have been, alive into the 1800s. Standing tall when towns were already rising and maps were being drawn. This creates a strange contrast. Modern nature says these giants shouldn't exist. Historical records say they absolutely did, which leaves us standing between two worlds, the scientific present and the mysterious past, trying to connect the broken pieces. For now, one thing is certain: the enormous trees described by the early settlers were not merely oversized versions of modern redwoods. They were something other, something older, something that defies easy explanation. And their disappearance leaves behind a question that echoes through every photograph, every journal entry, and every stump that survives. What kind of world produces life at that scale? And why did that world vanish so quickly? If the forests of early California were truly as massive as the journals and photographs suggest, then the pace of their disappearance becomes even more unsettling. It wasn't a slow decline. It wasn't natural depletion. It wasn't random pockets of logging here and there. It was fast, coordinated, targeted. Almost as if someone had drawn invisible circles around certain groves long before the lumberjacks arrived. During the mid-1800s, as the world focused on the frenzy of the gold rush, another operation quietly unfolded in the shadows of the mountains. It did not involve miners, fortune seekers, or the glowing promise of wealth. It involved the forests, specifically the oldest, largest, and most inaccessible sections of them. Records from that time, the ones that survive, tell a strange story. A story of logging companies setting up operations in remote valleys before any major demand for timber existed. A story of trees felled in regions where transportation was nearly impossible. No roads, no railways, no ports nearby. A story of wood being harvested in quantities that didn't match the infrastructure needs of the era. The official explanation was simple. California was growing. Cities needed timber. But when you look closely, the timeline doesn't match. San Francisco was still in its infancy. Sacramento was little more than a cluster of muddy streets. Railroads were years away from large-scale expansion, and yet, enormous, ancient groves, far from civilization, were already being cleared. The question is simple: why cut there first? Lumberjacks of the period asked the same thing in their journals. Some speculated the bosses wanted the best wood, the densest trunks, the tallest cuts. But others noticed patterns that didn't fit economics. Entire groves targeted at once. Camps instructed to clear specific valleys, even if hauling the timber out made little sense. Crews moved from one remote, ancient pocket of forest to another, ignoring younger, more accessible redwoods that would have been easier and cheaper to process. It was as if someone wanted the giants, specifically. Not the forests, not the lumber, the giants. And the speed at which they disappeared is astonishing. Within a few decades, a blink in the lifespan of a redwood, massive trees that had stood for thousands of years were gone. Entire landscapes were transformed, valleys flattened, hillsides stripped. The stumps left behind were so wide that teams of men posed proudly on top of them like hunters beside fallen beasts. But even those stumps faded from memory. Many were burned, buried, or left to rot. The early photographs that survive hint at something unsettling. Some show clearings so vast you can't see the edge. Others show only stumps, no remaining trees in sight. A few rare images show rows of cut trunks stacked like monoliths from a demolished city. Their rings so tightly packed they seem carved rather than grown. But here's the strange part. The paperwork doesn't support the scale of the destruction. Shipping logs don't match the volume of lumber photographed inventory reports list far less timber than the forests should have yielded. And some logging companies mentioned in local newspapers vanish from the record entirely. No final ledgers, no closure dates, no archives. Just gone. Almost like they appeared for one purpose and disappeared once the purpose was fulfilled. Historians often chalk this up to poor record keeping, fires, or early bureaucracy. All reasonable explanations. But when missing archives, vanished companies, contradictory reports, and targeted clearings repeat across multiple counties, the pattern begins to feel intentional. Some researchers, speculative, not mainstream, suggest there may have been a deeper motivation, not economic, not agricultural, not logistical, but erasure. Erasing something that didn't fit the emerging narrative of the new world. Erasing living monuments that hinted at an older Earth with different conditions. Erasing natural structures of a scale that defied modern understanding. Erasing anything that might have pointed backward to a forgotten chapter of history. Whether this was a coordinated plan or a consequence of rapid industrial expansion remains an open question. But one thing is undeniable. The largest, oldest trees, the ones that challenged our sense of scale, biology, and time, were the first to fall. Not the youngest, not the most convenient, not the ones near towns, the giants. These trees did not simply vanish, they were removed, fast, selectively and with a precision that still feels suspicious today. When written records fail and oral memories blur, one kind of evidence remains harder to dismiss: photographs. Not the polished images we know today, but the grainy, sepia-toned glimpses captured by early photographers who likely never realized what they were documenting. The surviving photographs from California's first logging era are haunting, not because of ghosts or shadows, but because of scale. A scale so immense it almost breaks the frame. In one image, a group of lumberjacks stands beside a fallen trunk, their bodies almost swallowed by its mass. 12 men together barely span half its width. Their faces are small, their tools look like toys, and even the ox pulling the timber looks comically undersized beside the tree's enormous ribs of bark. Another photograph shows a stump so wide that a horse-drawn carriage could have parked comfortably on top. The stump rings ripple outward like the side of a geological cliff, thousands of years etched into wooden stone. The ground around it is clear, almost empty, as if the felling of that single giant changed the landscape itself. Then there are the images where the tree lies horizontally across the forest floor, yet still stretches beyond the frame. The photographer couldn't capture the full length, not for lack of trying, but because the lenses and plates of the time simply weren't large enough to contain it. The trunk becomes a blurred wall of bark disappearing into the background like the hull of a ship. Most strange of all is the feeling these photographs give off, a feeling of imbalance, a feeling that something enormous is missing from the world today. The stumps don't look like the bases of trees. They look like foundations of structures, perfect circles, walls rising from the earth, platforms built into the sides where men once stood to cut through the thickest parts. In several images, the giant stumps tower above the standing men, not just wider, but so tall that the men appear knee-height against them. It creates a strange illusion, as if the lumberjacks weren't cutting trees, but dismantling monuments left behind by a forgotten age. Some researchers argue that these photographs show more than forestry. They show the removal of scale itself, the destruction of a natural architecture so enormous that modern forests feel miniature by comparison. Because it isn't just the width of the stumps that shocks the eye. It's the density, the tightness of the rings, the suggestion that these organisms had lived through millennia upon millennia of seasons, storms, cycles, and changes long before any human settlements rose in California. And yet, they were brought down in a matter of weeks. Modern viewers often assume these images must be exaggerated, edited, or distorted by old camera lenses. But carpenters and forestry experts who study the photos point out something unsettling. The axes, the saws, the men, the tools all appear at correct proportions, which means the trees were as large as they appear. So we're left with a question that grows heavier with each photograph. If trees of this magnitude truly existed well into the 1800s, why does our modern world have almost no trace of them? We have monuments that are thousands of years old, ruins that survive even after civilizations fall. But these giants, the largest living structures on the continent, vanished almost completely. The photographs become a kind of unintentional confession, a record of a world that was erased faster than it could be understood. Evidence of something vast, ancient, and inconvenient to history. A single stump, enormous, alone, silent, with a man standing on top so small he might as well be a child. And in that image, something becomes painfully clear. The world once held giants, and someone somewhere made sure they didn't survive long enough to be studied. If the early photographs showed the giants after they fell, then the journals, the sketches, and the whispered folklore reveal something far stranger. The giants did not fall quietly. Among lumberjacks, surveyors, and even early settlers, there are recurring descriptions of working inside groves that felt alive in a way forests no longer do. Not alive like ordinary trees, alive in a way that made the forest feel aware. Men who spent months in the deep valleys of Humboldt and Mendocino wrote about a presence in the groves, a heaviness in the air, a sense that the trees themselves were part of some vast, interconnected system. To most historians, these are just poetic exaggerations from exhausted workers. But the consistency of the accounts, across camps, counties, and decades, hints at something deeper. They describe forests that behaved differently. Some lumberjacks swore that sound traveled strangely among the giants, footsteps echoing twice, voices returning from odd directions, the creaking of distant branches sounding like whale calls or muted thunder. Others said that the air felt thicker beneath the oldest crowns, as if they were standing under a dome, inside a structure rather than a simple grove. A few even wrote that the trees seemed to speak when cut, not supernatural voices, but a low rumble that made the ground vibrate, not a scream, but a resonance, as if harming one tree disturbed the entire forest network. And here's where the folklore gets unsettling. Native tribes throughout the Pacific coast passed down stories of sentinel trees, living guardians that anchored the land. Trees so old that they predated their own mythologies. Trees that kept the balance between rivers, storms, and the movements of animals. Trees that watched centuries without aging the way modern trees do. To them, the giants weren't wood. They were beings. Beings with patience measured not in decades, but in epochs. When the lumberjacks arrived, the tribes warned them, not with hostility, but with despair. They said, "If you cut the elders, the land will change. When the giants fall, the storms will return. These trees hold the wind." The lumberjacks didn't understand. Their bosses didn't care. What mattered was profit. Or at least, that was the explanation given. But part 6 isn't about logging companies or profits. It's about something stranger. Something that official history glides past too quickly. Why did the environment change so violently after the giants fell? By the late 1800s, less than 40 years after the largest trees were cut, California experienced massive floods, extreme erosion hillsides, collapsing rivers, changing course valleys, drying up wildlife patterns, shifting, and weather that locals could not predict anymore. Newspapers wrote about angry storms, runaway rivers, and vanishing springs. Scientists blamed early settlement. Politicians blamed poor planning. But the oldest tribes blamed one thing: the loss of the giants. In their worldview, the giants weren't just trees. They were regulators of the land, anchors, stabilizers, the bones of the earth. Remove them, and the land becomes unbalanced. This might sound mystical until you consider something modern scientists do acknowledge. Giant trees fundamentally change the environment. Their roots prevent landslides. Their canopies regulate rainfall patterns. Their trunks store unimaginable amounts of moisture. Their shade stabilizes soil temperatures. Their presence cools whole valleys. Now imagine trees triple the size of modern redwoods. Trees thousands of years older. Trees with root systems so deep they might have connected mountain ranges. Trees capable of influencing microclimates across entire regions. The forest wasn't scenery. It was a machine, alive, complex, ancient. And when those machines were dismantled, the land reacted. But here's where the mystery deepens. Several lumberjack journals mention something they weren't allowed to talk about publicly. Trees that did not fall the way they were supposed to. Some cuts would take days to prepare. But when the final wedge was removed, the giant wouldn't fall. it would stand, leaning, murmuring, as if resisting gravity itself. Other times, a tree would fall silent, no thunderous crash, no shaking earth, simply settling into the forest floor, like a sinking ship swallowed by fog. A few crews wrote about trees that healed partially overnight, sap sealing wounds faster than seemed natural. Others described trunks that felt warm to the touch. One foreman even wrote, "I have cut many things in my life, but this is the first time the thing felt aware of being cut." These men were rough, practical, hard-edged. Not spiritualists, not myth-seekers. And yet their accounts sound less like forestry reports and more like encounters with something they didn't fully understand. And then there's the strangest detail of all. Some trees, the biggest, oldest, most massive, were not felled by lumberjacks. They were already dead, standing like colossal skeletons, hollowed out as if burned from the inside with no sign of fire. How does a tree the size of a modern skyscraper die from within while still standing? What force creates that pattern? Scientists have theories. Folklore has darker explanations. Speculative researchers suggest these dead giants might have been remnants of a different environmental era, living artifacts left behind after some cataclysm long before humans arrived. And that brings us to the core mystery of Part 6. Were the giants simply trees, or were they the last remnants of a world older than our recorded history? Because if they were just trees, their removal shouldn't have altered California so dramatically. But it did. If they were just trees, their scale shouldn't dwarf modern species to an almost impossible degree. But it did. If they were just trees, folklore wouldn't describe them as guardians, regulators, anchors of the land itself. But it does. And if they were just trees, the forest shouldn't have fought back. But according to dozens of first-hand accounts, it did. Part 6 ends with a realization that finally brings the pieces together. The giants were not simply cut down. They were removed from an ecosystem that depended on them. And the land has been recovering from the trauma ever since.